Hello and welcome to the program. Our special guest on the show today is the Controller General of Accounts, Government of India, Shri M.J. Joseph. Mr. Joseph, a warm welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me in this program.
Let's begin our conversation and talk about the Civil Accounts Service. It's a relatively new civil service, some 4 decades old. Tell us about its inception and how it all began.
We are just 4 decades old. But having said that, it is not that the profession of government accounting is only 4 decades. It goes back to olden times when the accountants or the munims of kings and rajas and maharajas and kingdoms and so on always used to maintain the accounts of the kingdom, the accounts of the expenditures of the kingdom or the revenues of the kingdom. Now that has always been there. Now it was really in the during the governance of India during the East India Company days when the role of audit also started evolving. Just to mention to you, the humble writers who used to come from England, young boys, you know the building in Calcutta, the Writers' Building. The writers were basically writers who used to record transactions of the company, the East India Company. Hence they were called writers, writers of the books of accounts, of recording expenditures and receipts. Well, that carried on for some time during East India Company rule. I think it was late in the 18th century when the East India Company or the Governor General decided to bring in the Auditor General. Before that you had the Accountant General. Now the Auditor General's post was created essentially to have some kind of a check on the finances of the company. There were deep suspicions whether the company, the East India Company, was actually getting its true revenues or was there pilferage and
so
leakage.
they were looking at both sides, expenditure as well as
Precisely.
revenue.
So as a result, the audit function also started evolving. And that carried on practically not only up to independence, but even during the 1950s and 60s. It was in the 1970s that government started having a relook. And for various reasons which I'll come to, thought it necessary and appropriate to transfer and separate the accounting function from the auditing function. And I think there were 2 or 3 main reasons for it. One was the question of conflict of interest. The issue was, should the same authority who is maintaining the accounts
be the
also
auditor
be the auditor of the same accounts? Inherently
Very
there
valid.
is. The second issue was ownership. Governance now was, the development plans of the government required expenditures to increase and so on and so forth. Now, if there were delays in the payment process or in the revenue collection process or in the submission of the accounts and so on, while it was being done by an external agency, government felt it more suitable to internalize that function within the union government so as to make the ministries or the departments of the union government assume the ownership of this function rather than giving it to an external agency to do so. The third was also the need for improved financial reporting. You need timely reports of the financial status of the government. You needed to have an analysis about the financial situation. So I think it was a mixture of all these 3 factors that was responsible for the landmark historic decision which was taken between the years 75, 76 that resulted in the creation of a new service separate from the parent Indian Audit and Accounts Service called as the Indian Civil Accounts Service, which came into force from 1st of March 1976. Since then, especially in the recent past, we have been celebrating March 1st of every year
Okay.
as our Civil Accounts Day to mark our, our evolution since then.
Yeah.
So I think it was a combination of all these factors that was responsible for the creation of the Indian Civil Accounts Service.
This is probably the theoretical thing and what has been documented historically. But there's also an unofficial story to it. We all have heard about our former Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, that there was an issue which led her to take a very staunch stand and said that no, this bifurcation has to happen and accounts has to be separated from audit function. I'm sure you would have heard this from your seniors, your bosses, and it's not that long in public memory that people would simply forget. So is there some truth in that?
I have heard so.
Okay.
Now, whether it is true or not, I really wouldn't know. There has been a lot of conjecturing.
Okay.
But all that I'd like to point out is that such decisions are not taken overnight.
Okay.
It is a process of time. And I must tell you, there was, in the early to middle 70s, there was a very famous committee called as, I think, the Yardi Committee.
Okay.
There was a group of ministers that was constituted during, I think it was in 1973, to look into the whole gamut of financial administration, improvements to financial administration,
Okay.
as a result of which the decision was taken.
Accounts would come under government function, whereas audit is actually, and by way of constitution, a totally independent person. The CAG happens to be totally independent of the government, whereas accounts comes under the finance ministry, isn't it?
When you take ownership of a certain function like the payment and accounting and financial reporting, and it leads to greater accountability.
Okay.
Accountability of the spending agency to the line ministry and the line ministry to Parliament. Ultimately, as you know, the budget is voted by Parliament. Appropriations are voted by Parliament. And therefore, when the payment and accounting function is internalized in the ministry or department concerned, you automatically assume ownership in the manner that those public funds are spent or misspent, whatever be the case. And that was one of the major driving forces, that you must take ownership, which was in tune with good practices globally. And I must tell you that India was one of the very few developing countries at that time that had taken this historic decision to separate it. Even now I can tell you in many African countries, where some of whom I've worked with, there is a unified accounting and auditing system.
Okay.
There are. So we must see it in the context of time as to how far ahead the government of India was, even in the 1970s.
70s, yeah. What would you say? Has it served the purpose? Has it completely taken on the responsibility and delivered what was expected of this?
Undoubtedly so.
Okay.
Undoubtedly so. As I said, initially there was, as I understand from my seniors, over 100 officers from the parent Indian Audit and Accounts Department had to be transferred to the union government, to the new service, the Indian Civil Accounts Service. And I remember hearing stories about how they had to start operations.
Right from
No
scratch.
one knew.
Yeah.
They didn't have offices. Some of them, I'm told, had to operate even from garages
Oh God.
because there was no infrastructure. And suddenly there was this bunch of people, and they were asked, now start a new payment and accounting function. I must give them all credit.
That's true.
From that humble stage, how they started, the difficulties that they faced, the inconveniences. They didn't face all these problems when they were with the parent department. But these 100 officers and the staff who were now transferred to the new setup, they started functioning with very little, organizational and infrastructural support, especially in the 1970s. Now, since then, obviously, we were completely in the manual-driven form. Our records, our ledgers, everything was paper-based. And one of the first things that the service did was to seize the opportunity of information technology, computerization, and automation. And therefore, we started investing in our automation processes. It started off actually, even from the humble voucher and the challan that builds up into more sophisticated packages. Now, we did receive a lot of help from the National Informatics Center, NIC, and I must thank the NIC for having consistently over the years, 4 decades now, for having supported the accounting function.
True.
So much so today that we run far more sophisticated payment and accounting systems.
But this computerization would have started only in the 90s.
No, much earlier. In the late 1970s it started in our department.
In 70s?
In the late 1970s, 1979, 80, around the time that I joined service. I still remember, how those accounts booklets used to be prepared. I'm told by my seniors that they had to actually, we didn't have computer systems, but the University of Delhi those days did have. So some of my senior colleagues who were more IT savvy, they used to be the ones who were on the forefront of computerization. And the mainframes that were there in the University of Delhi, they were used to produce it. So it started much ahead of many, many other government departments. And that's helped us in great stead.
Because in most of the departments it started in the 80s, maybe.
Absolutely correct.
Late 80s.
Absolutely. I think we were clearly about a cool
10
7,
years
8, 10 years ahead. Certainly we were. And that's paid rich dividends. Rich dividends because, as you can see the scale of government's operations, fiscal operations increasing. If you look at the budget of 1976 and if you look at the budget of 2015, 2016, today your expenditure budget is something like 17.5 lakh crores of rupees, of which around 90% goes through the e-payment mode. About a little over 92, 93% of our revenue collections, revenue receipts, both direct taxes and indirect taxes, flow through the e-payment route. So we were there. We were well positioned to use technology as well as network with banking services and technology. As changes were taking place in banking services and banking technologies, the accounting system equally benefited. And so much so, we are today in a position, frankly, of reporting practically on a real-time basis. This capability has been developed. So now we are in the month of February, and March is a very crucial year, and everybody would like to know what is the status of expenditures, of revenues. In earlier days, there were more guesstimates because information had to flow from different sources, so you could only model or you could guesstimate. But today, you practically
very
have
precise ones.
Absolutely reliable,
To the last
accurate, to the last rupee, as you rightly said. Yes. So that's been a very exciting phase, isn't it, over the last 4 decades? From nothing, from a manual system, you moved 40 years later to a fairly sophisticated, I would say certainly a very sophisticated IT-based payment and accounting system.
But does your department capture every rupee which the government spends or gets?
Practically it is. I mean, there are some kind of funds which are maintained outside the government account for various purposes, maybe for secrets service funds or for some other kind of purposes. They are maintained in personal deposit accounts and so on and so forth. But I think there is practically a near 100% coverage because those kind of funds are very, very small in nature. But there is practically a